Hey, podcast friends. This is Dr. Steve Hewlett with the podcast Simple Healthy Choices for Weight Loss, where every week we help people who have realized that as their health has been declining over the years, the number of medications they are being prescribed is increasing. We want to help you reverse this health path so you can live the vibrant, pain-free, and hopefully medication-free life you deserve to live. If you'd like even more information on this topic, you can go to Amazon or Audible and pick up my book, Your Plate is Your Fate. And if you think my book helps you on your new health path, please tell your friends and leave a review where you purchased it. Hey, podcast friends. Welcome back to another podcast. And in today's, I want to explain a term that gets thrown around, especially a lot with diabetics and when dietitians are talking to diabetics about the proper nutrition. And that term is called the glycemic index. So you may have heard people talking about, that carbohydrate's a high glycemic carb and that's a low glycemic carb. And so I wanted to explain what that meant and really why glycemic index really isn't a very good thing to use to measure the glucose load of a product or of a carbohydrate. So besides glycemic index, I'm also going to talk to you about glycemic load and also the insulin index. So first, what is the glycemic index? Glycemic index, what that's talking about is, and this was actually created back in 1981, but what this does is it ranks all carbohydrate-containing foods according to their ability to raise your blood glucose levels. So something that has a high carbohydrate or a high glycemic index is something that when you eat it, your blood glucose is going to go very high, and which is going to stimulate your insulin. To a low glycemic carb, usually these are the carbohydrates that have a lot of the fiber and protein and things and like that. So it stays in your intestine for a longer period of time. So when it stays in your intestines for long periods of time, it's slowly releasing the carbs into your bloodstream, which slowly is getting converted into to glucose. And so your glucose levels don't tend to rise as high. And then you also have more of a time for insulin to come in and decrease the glucose in the blood also. So that's what a high glycemic versus low glycemic is. But what this does, and again, this only looks at carbohydrates. And that's mainly because, like we said, the basic building block of carbohydrates is glucose. So even though protein and fat can actually be turned into glucose if it's needed, usually it's not ever needed because we eat so many carbohydrates all the time. We get all the glucose and way more than we need. And this is why our body does the opposite. Most often what's going on is we're turning glucose into fat. And then with our high insulin levels, we're causing our bodies to store that fat. So what the glycemic index is, again, this is only testing glucose. So this is something that really drives me crazy because there are people out there who are touting that high fructose corn syrup is good for diabetics because it's low on the glycemic index. This is crazy. Remember, there are three different main carbohydrates, your macronutrients, and that's protein, fat, and then carbohydrates. But when you look at the saccharides, there's also three monosaccharides. There's glucose, fructose, and galactose. So since the glycemic index is measuring the glucose in the blood, that obviously fructose is going to rank low on the glucose scale. That's just like if there was a fructose index and you looked at glucose. Well, now the glucose is going to rank low on the fructose scale too, because they're not the same. Just to give you an idea, fructose actually has a glycemic index of 19 to 23. And the reason that has any level at all is because, remember, fructose, part of it when it gets metabolized can actually get metabolized into glucose. So since fructose can get turned into glucose if the body needs it to, it has a small glycemic index, again, of 19 to 23. But this has nothing to do with the toxicities of fructose. Fructose is something you need to stay away from. It has nothing to do with the glycemic index. It has nothing to do with it not being able to raise your insulin levels. It has everything to do with the way the body has to metabolize this in the liver to get rid of it, because it's not a product, it's not a chemical that our body wants to have in it. So just because fructose ranks low on the glycemic index has nothing to do with its toxicity. You still need to stay away from sugar, high fructose corn syrup, and all the things like that, which they put in almost every box, bottle, bag, and can that's out there. So sugar and high fructose corn syrup, when you look at those, remember sugar and high fructose corn syrup, the exact same thing, except for sugar, like the table sugar, which is sucrose, it's 50% glucose and 50% fructose. And then high fructose corn syrup is the exact same thing. It's glucose and fructose, but just a little bit different amounts of the fructose as far as the percentages of it. But since sugar is half glucose and half fructose, when you measure that on the glucose scale, high fructose corn syrup has a glucose or glycemic index of 87, and sugar has a glycemic index of around 60. So again, you would think because glucose on the glycemic index scale, glucose, they just gave a random number of 100, and everything else is compared to glucose. So obviously, since sugar is only half glucose and half fructose, it's only going to be about half. So it's about 60. And the reason it's not 50 is because, again, fructose can get turned into glucose if you need it. And that's why the high fructose corn syrup is also a little bit higher, around 87. But that's all because it's a combination of glucose and fructose. Now, something I wanted to point out is maltodextrin. Maltodextrin is something that I talked about back in the podcast when we were talking about artificial sweeteners. But maltodextrin is something that companies like to put in a lot of things, especially things with artificial sweeteners, because it tends to bulk it up a little bit. So it's more like it isn't so sweet. But maltodextrin actually has a glycemic index of 105 to 110. So maltodextrin actually raises your glucose, your blood glucose, even higher than glucose does all by itself. Because remember, glucose has the glycemic index of 100. Okay. But all this really doesn't matter, because what happened, that what glycemic index is they took 50-gram portions of carbohydrates. So they have all these different carbohydrates. All of them are 50 grams. And then they would have people eat these 50-gram portions, and then they would start taking their glucose levels over the next 2 hours. And they would plot this out on a graph. And when they did that, what they found out was that there's a curve. And so the area under the curve is what's actually being recorded as the glycemic index. But what they found out is that 50 grams, you can get 50 grams on some carbs, but other carbs is going to take you a lot to be able to get 50 grams worth of food. So what they did was, and an example of this actually is like 50 grams. If you're looking at 50 grams of carbohydrates, if you're looking at something like watermelon, that's mostly water, you're going to have to eat a ton of watermelon in order to get 50 grams. But if you're looking at something like tortilla chips, you can get 50 grams easily in one setting. So it really didn't make any sense to say 50 grams of each, the glycemic index, saying 50 grams when there's no way in the world you would eat 50 grams of watermelon. So because of that, what they did, instead of just having the glycemic index, they came up with the glycemic load. And the glycemic load is where they actually looked at not only the glycemic index of how much a certain carbohydrate is going to raise your blood glucose, but they also looked at what is a normal portion size that you would normally eat. And so this is why they came up with the glycemic load. And the glycemic load, it takes the glycemic index and it multiplies this times the actual grams of carbs that are in a normal serving. And then they take that number and they divide that by 100. So as an example, to try to make this very simple, carrots have a glycemic index of 50. Tortilla chips have a glycemic index of 52. So really, if you eat a carrot or whether you're eating tortilla chips, your glucose is going to go up about the same according to the glycemic index. However, when you look at the serving size of carrots, one normal serving size is about 4 grams. to where a normal serving size of tortilla chips is about 50 grams. So when you take in the serving size of carrots of 4 grams and you want to calculate the glycemic load, again, you take the glycemic index, which is 50, about the same as tortilla chips, but now you multiply 50 times 4 because 4 grams is a normal serving size of carrots. So 50 times 4, so that's 200 divided by 100, and that equals a glycemic load of 2. Now, do the exact same thing with tortilla chips. Tortilla chips, remember, as far as the glycemic index, it's about the same. It's 52. But the amount of carbs that you eat in tortilla chips in one normal serving is about 50 grams. So now you're taking 52 times 50, so the glycemic index times the normal gram portion size. So it's 52 times 50, and then divide that by 100. And now what you end up with 26. So when you look at glycemic index, carrots and tortilla chips are about the same, 50 and 52. But when you do the glycemic load, now you have the glycemic load of carrots being only 2 and the glycemic load of tortilla chips being 26, which means you would have to eat 13 times more than a normal serving of carrots in order to get the same glucose load that you're going to be getting when you eat tortilla chips. And this is another reason why, so many reasons why tortilla chips are so bad for you, but this is just another reason why. But in reality, a lot of this, it doesn't really make that big a difference as far as your glucose, because what really, really matters is, as I've been talking about on my podcast, is your insulin. So just because you have a high glucose load or a low glucose load, it all depends on what the insulin actually does. And this is why in 1977, Suzanne Holt came up with the insulin index. And this makes so much more sense because it's not the fact that you have high blood glucose that is the problem with diabetes. It's because the constant high insulin that your body has produced to get rid of that glucose. And now you keep your insulin levels high, you become insulin resistant. It takes more and more insulin to keep your glucose down to a certain load until you become so insulin resistant, it doesn't matter what you do anymore, because the more insulin you put in, the more insulin resistance you get, and just the worse and worse your diabetes gets. So that's why the key to diabetes is not just keeping your glucose levels low. You've got to keep your insulin levels low as well. And so what the insulin index does is this actually measures your insulin in response to food. Now, on the glycemic index, they only looked at carbohydrates because carbohydrates are the only ones that actually produce glucose. But there's actually protein and fat can also stimulate the insulin, but not very much at all. So of the 3 macronutrients, without a doubt, carbohydrates, those are the ones that really stimulate your glucose and stimulate your insulin release. Protein does just a little bit, not really that much. And then fat doesn't hardly stimulate your insulin at all. And that's why I keep telling you over and over, there's only, protein gets broken down to amino acids to build other proteins in your body. Fat gets broken down to fatty acids, and you can use that for your energy source, or carbohydrates get broken down to glucose, use that for your energy source. But when you use fat for your energy source, you're not stimulating insulin, and so you're not getting all the insulin resistance and all the problems that you have with blood pressure and organ damage and everything else that you get when you eat carbohydrates. So when you just look at the index or the insulin index, the ones that raise your insulin by far more than anything is that's going to be your processed carbohydrates. These are the ones that you're going to get in the box, bottle, bag, or can. The flour and everything they use, they get rid of all the fiber, all the phytonutrients. They put tons of chemicals in there. And this food, as soon as you eat it, you get a huge glucose response. You get a huge insulin response. So processed carbs are by far the worst on the insulin index, and actually on the other indexes as well. And then below that is when you have protein mixed with the carbohydrates. And again, remember, when you mix something like protein with the carbohydrates, they stay in the GI tract for a longer period of time, and they're just slowly getting absorbed. So these are going to be things like fruits and vegetables, because they're going to have the fiber, they're going to have the phytonutrients, they're going to have the protein. And so they don't get absorbed in anywhere near as fast as the regular processed carbohydrates. And then below that is going to be just plain protein. So like if you eat meat, you may get a little bit of an insulin response, but not very much. And then again, fat is way down on the list. It doesn't stimulate insulin almost at all. So that's basically the whole difference. So glycemic index, it takes 50 gram portions of all the carbohydrates, and it measures to see what your glucose level is over a 2-hour period. So that's the glycemic index. Glycemic load goes one step further, and it actually takes in the actual serving size. Like we said, with carrots, an actual serving size is only about 4 grams, but with tortilla chips, it's about 50 grams. So you have to look at what the actual serving size is, as well as the type of carbohydrate it is, to really get a good idea of the glycemic load. But all this aside, the insulin index is by far the best way to be able to test whether a food is good for you or not. And again, they've already looked at it, and we know exactly what foods are good, what foods actually stimulate insulin, and which ones don't. So again, stay away from processed food, like I say in every one of these, and you want to stick more to your just real meat, your real fruits, and your real vegetables. And again, we talked about this, as far as how there's 2 different kinds of energy sources, fat and carbohydrates. Then you need protein for your building blocks of your body. And God knows this. If you look around in nature, you have proteins that are mixed with carbohydrates, like fruits and vegetables. And then you have proteins that are mixed with fat, like what's in real meat, real animal meat. But there is nothing in nature where you have a carbohydrate and a fat mixed together. It's not seen. The only time you're going to see that is in man-made food. And that's when we're talking about like things like pizza, donuts, crackers, potato chips, cookies. I mean, you could go on and on. But when they put carbohydrates and they put fat, especially with these horrible, horrible vegetable and seed oils, when they put that combination together, it's like a ticking time bomb in your body. And not just because of the carbohydrates, but because of all the oils and all the chemicals and everything that they're put in there as well. It causes inflammation all over your body. And then there's a couple other things that also raise your insulin that doesn't have anything to do with food being in your gut and then being put into your bloodstream. And we talked about this a little bit earlier also, like the cephalic phase. And this is what they found out when they were looking at artificial sweeteners. And just the fact that somebody puts an artificial sweetener or even a regular glucose or sugar in their mouth, and they don't even swallow it, they just swish it around and spit it out. Just that sweetness in the mouth automatically causes your body to start producing insulin because it's getting ready for the next meal. So when you chew gum or anything like that, when you have something sweet in your mouth, your body is already getting ready to start producing insulin. And the other thing is the incretins, which I've talked about in other podcasts also. The incretins, these are released from your GI tract. And the whole purpose for releasing incretins is because you want your glucose levels to stay low. So these incretins, what they do is, one, they're going to keep the food in the stomach for a longer period of time. Then they're also going to cause your liver to produce more, or your pancreas to produce more insulin to try to keep that glucose level low. And it's going to inhibit the liver from being able to produce sugar, because remember, you have glycogen stores in the liver that gets broken down into glucose if you ever need it. So these incretins try to keep all that from happening. But at first, they're going to stimulate your insulin because they're trying to get the glucose down out of your body. So again, that's just something from the incretins that causes insulin to go up, just like the cephalic phase causes your insulin to go up, but it really doesn't have anything to do with the product itself or the carbohydrate itself. And this is where you see a lot of the problems with some of these artificial sweeteners, that they're non-nutritive, there's no calories, but just the fact that you have a sweetener in your mouth, it's going to cause your insulin to go up, which can make your blood glucose go down, which can make you hungry. So even these artificial sweeteners can actually make you hungry and make you eat more. So in and of themselves, they're not going to be causing weight issues, but if they make you hungry and you don't change the type of food you eat, then even artificial sweeteners can stimulate an appetite and can make you become even more obese and can hurt your diabetes. So anyway, a little bit side notes on all those, but that's the difference between glycemic index, glycemic load, which takes in the serving size, and then the insulin index, which is really what you care about, is what are these foods doing to your insulin. So I hope that didn't get confusing. I hope you understood. But this is something to look at, think about, but it's really not that big a deal. If they talk about something being high glycemic or low glycemic, it really depends on the rest of the meal that you have. So if you do want to eat a carb, if you do need to eat a carb, it's going to be a lot better if you eat it with your meal. Eat it with protein, eat it with your fruits or vegetables. And so you can have the fiber in there, the phytonutrients. It can slow down the absorption so it doesn't get into your bloodstream quite as slow. So that'll help hopefully keep your insulin levels low as well. So, and again, even with the desserts, it's going to be better to have your meal and then have your dessert right then instead of waiting like an hour or two and then having dessert, because now you're just putting all that glucose in there and all the fiber and everything that you're getting from your normal meal with your protein, that's already going to be digested and gone. So it's not going to help you keep your insulin level low. So anyway, that's all I have about this today. And I hope that made sense to you. If not, please comment below. You can go to our website, balancedfitlifestyles.com. You can get a hold of me through you can go to Facebook and just put Steve Hewlett in, or Dr. Steve Hewlett, and ask me whatever questions. And if there's a certain topic that you would like for me to talk about, just let me know. And I would love to do that because I want to educate as many people as I can on how they can eat healthy, get off of medications, and end up having a better quality life. So for right now, thank you so much for listening and have a great week. And remember, make simple, healthy choices to live a quality life. If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit the subscribe button below and be sure to tell someone else who may want to change their health path as well. And don't forget, you can also purchase my book, Your Plate is Your Fate, on Amazon or Audible. And if you do, please leave a review.